Welcome to Pattern of Power's Sleepless series, a place for restless nights, where history becomes a calm companion. Here we move slowly, not battles and noise, but quiet rivers of change. Before we begin, if these journeys bring you rest, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps this small corner of history keep glowing in the dark. Tonight, we wander through the quiet corridors of time, where power often survived not with swords but with new names and gentle disguises. This is the power of rebranding. From Rome to Byzantium, from Egypt to the Ottomans, and even in our modern world, we will see how power endures by changing its face. And so we begin. Slowly, gently, let the night carry us. Chapter 1. Rome, from Republic to Empire. Picture Rome in its earliest days. Not the empire of legend, not yet the marble capital of the known world, but a town upon 7 hills. The sun rises gently over those hills, its first light falling on rooftops of clay and tile. Thin trails of smoke rise from hearths. Farmers lead donkeys down narrow lanes, their baskets heavy with olives and figs. The smell of baking bread floats through the air, warm and comforting, mingling with the sharper scent of cured fish, and the sweetness of ripe fruit piled high in woven baskets. The streets are uneven, stones worn smooth by years of footsteps. Merchants call softly to passers-by, their voices blending with the bark of dogs, and the laughter of children who run through the alleys, their sandals slapping rhythmically against the ground. The sound of water splashing in public fountains mixes with the chatter of neighbours greeting one another. This is Rome. Still small, still youthful, yet already restless. Its people are sturdy, practical, ambitious. Their eyes are fixed not only on the present, but on the possibilities of tomorrow. At the city's heart lies the Forum. Even in these early years, it is the place where Rome breathes. Here, citizens gather in the open air. Here, disputes are heard, deals are struck, and speeches are delivered with careful cadence. The Forum is not just a marketplace. It is the soul of the city, a space where voices shape destiny. The Romans had long ago cast out their kings. The memory of monarchy lingered like a warning. No single man, they said, should ever again hold absolute power, and so they built their republic. A system meant to divide authority, to scatter it across many hands. At the top were the consuls, always 2, never 1. Their power was balanced, each able to check the other. Each year they were chosen anew, a reminder that leadership was not permanent. The Romans trusted the rhythm of rotation, the safety of shared command. Beneath them were the assemblies. Citizens gathered, votes were cast, decisions were made beneath the open sky. The people believed their voices mattered, that their raised hands carried weight, that Rome's path was steered by their will. Above all stood the Senate. Older, wealthier, more experienced, its members debated endlessly. They quoted history, they invoked tradition. Their words filled the chamber, rising and falling like tides. Long speeches, deliberate gestures, a theatre of power where voices replaced swords. This was the Republic. Not the rule of one, but the rule of many. A balance carefully maintained, a system carefully guarded. It gave the people comfort. Rome, they believed, was theirs. No king, no tyrant, only shared rule, shared voices, shared pride. And yet, beneath the marble, beneath the debates and rituals, a current of change was flowing, slowly, quietly, almost unseen. Rome grew. What had been a city became a state. What had been a state became a power. Armies marched farther than any farmer could imagine. They crossed the Apennines, they crossed the Alps. They set foot on the shores of distant seas. They brought back stories of lands filled with strange foods, strange gods, strange skies. Victory followed victory. Gaul, Spain, Greece. Each campaign brought treasures. Each campaign brought captives. Each campaign filled Rome with spoils. Gold flowed into temples, silver filled coffers, exotic animals paraded through the streets as symbols of conquest. But with victory came something else: ambition. For the soldiers returning from war did not feel loyalty to the distant Senate. They felt loyalty to the generals who had led them into battle, who had promised them land and reward, who had shared their hardships in camp and field. The balance began to tilt, not with noise, but with a slow drift. The Republic still lived in law and ritual, but the heart of loyalty shifted. It beat not for institutions, but for men. Among those men, one figure grew larger than all the rest: Julius Caesar. His name still lingers in history, sharp and unforgettable. He was clever, ambitious, charismatic, a man of words and of action, a man who could charm in the Senate and command on the battlefield. In Gaul he led legions farther than Rome had ever dreamed, through forests thick with shadows, across rivers that swelled with rain, into lands where winter bit hard, and enemies were fierce. He conquered tribe after tribe, and with each victory his fame expanded. But Caesar was not only a soldier, he was a writer. He sent back to Rome reports of his campaigns, carefully written, clear, persuasive, casting himself as hero, as protector, as the very embodiment of Roman strength. While his armies marched, his words marched ahead of them. When he returned not only with legions, but with a legend already built. The people adored him. They saw in him a champion, a man who had given Rome wealth and glory. The Senate, however, grew uneasy. They saw a man who was too powerful, too beloved, too dangerous to the fragile balance of the Republic. And then came the Rubicon, a river, narrow and quiet, yet weighted with law and meaning. No general was to cross it with his army. To do so was to declare war against the Republic itself. Caesar stood before it. Behind him, loyal soldiers, their armour glinting faintly in the winter light. Ahead of him, the uncertain future. He knew the choice. To turn back was to lose everything. To cross was to begin something that could never be undone. And so he crossed. Step by step into the water, out onto the opposite bank. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of revolution. Rome trembled. The Senate could not contain him. The Republic could not restrain him. The balance had broken, yet even now he did not call himself king. That word still carried poison. That word still recalled tyranny. Instead, he wrapped himself in older titles. Dictator, a role the Romans already knew, a role meant for emergencies. But Caesar held it not for months, but for years. The title stretched, reshaped by his hand, until it no longer meant what it once had. The Senate still gathered. Elections still whispered through the streets. Ceremonies still unfolded with all their solemnity. But beneath the surface, the truth had changed. Power was no longer divided. It rested in one man. And then, as swiftly as he had risen, Caesar was gone, struck down by men who believed they were saving Rome. In the very chamber where debates had echoed, his body fell. Blood stained the marble, the air filled with shouts and confusion. The conspirators believed they had restored the Republic, but what they restored was only uncertainty. The people did not rise to defend the Senate. They mourned Caesar. They remembered his generosity, his triumphs, his promises. The Republic, fragile already, now seemed hollow. Into that hollow space stepped another, Augustus. He was young, cautious, deliberate. He had seen the fate of Caesar. He understood that power too boldly shown could be fatal. So he walked carefully. He spoke gently. He wrapped himself in the cloak of tradition. He did not call himself king. He did not wear a crown. Instead he called himself Princeps Dash, the first citizen, not a monarch, but a man among men, not above, but beside. The Senate still met, the assemblies still gathered, elections still flickered like old embers, but all decisions curved back to him. Every law, every judgment, every decree found its way to his hand. It was subtle, it was careful, it was deliberate. This is how power moves, not always in thunder, not always in storms. Sometimes it moves in silence, sometimes it moves in continuity. Sometimes it disguises itself in the clothing of the past. The Republic was never declared dead. No herald announced its end. It was simply reborn, quietly, gently, into empire. And the people accepted it, because they believed the words, because they trusted the forms, because they preferred the comfort of tradition to the fear of change. The words remained, the ceremonies continued. The cloak was familiar, but beneath it the shoulders were new. Rome endured not because the Republic survived, but because the empire disguised itself. It told the people a story they wanted to believe. That Rome was still theirs, that nothing had changed, even as everything had changed. This is the subtle strength of rebranding. It does not break, it bends, it does not shatter, it reshapes, it does not force, it persuades. And so Rome endured. An empire dressed as a republic, its people soothed, its power secure. The Republic did not vanish with a cry. It faded with a whisper, and Rome, eternal Rome, walked quietly into a new age. Chapter 2, Byzantium, the city of many names. Now, let us drift eastward, past the green hills of Italy, past the scattered islands of the Aegean, across the open waters where gulls circle lazily in the sky. The sea narrows, and there, like a silver ribbon glinting beneath the stars, lies the Bosphorus, a narrow channel, a meeting place of two vast continents. On one side, Europe, on the other, Asia. And at the crossing point where land and water weave together, a city has stood for more than 2,000 years. At first it was humble, a Greek colony, no greater than a cluster of stone houses upon a hillside. Fishermen mended their nets upon the shore. Merchants stacked clay jars of olive oil and amphorae of wine. Children ran barefoot along the docks, chasing the cries of seabirds. To the passing eye, Byzantium seemed small, perhaps ordinary, and yet its position was anything but ordinary. For every ship that sailed from the Black Sea toward the Mediterranean passed its harbour, every merchant carrying grain, honey, or furs from the northern lands looked toward its markets. Geography, more than ambition, had already written Byzantium's future. A city at a crossroads is never just a city. It is a stage waiting for an empire to arrive. Centuries passed. Empires rose and fell in the west. Rome, strong and unyielding, spread across Italy, across Gaul, across Africa, and eventually its gaze turned east. Byzantium became a Roman city. Its hills echoed not only with Greek voices but with Latin commands. Its streets bore soldiers' boots, officials' cloaks, and the rhythms of imperial administration. And then came Constantine, an emperor who looked beyond the crowded streets of Rome, whose eyes searched the horizon for a new capital. He saw more than a fishing town, more than a provincial port. He saw a city positioned between two worlds, Europe behind it, Asia before it, the Black Sea above, the Mediterranean below. To him, it was a crown waiting to be claimed. So Constantine crowned it. He encircled it with mighty walls, thick, high, and layered. Walls so formidable that, for 1,000 years, invading armies would break against them like waves against a cliff. He filled the city with marble forums where statues gleamed in the sun, with basilicas where priests lifted hymns toward vaulted ceilings, with palaces where mosaics glittered like jewels. He renamed it Constantinople, his city, the city of Constantine, a new Rome for the East. And new Rome it was. For 1,000 years Constantinople thrived. By day the markets hummed with traders from every corner of the known world. There were silks from China, their threads shimmering like captured moonlight. There were spices from India, fragrant even in the open air. There was silver from the Balkans, amber from the Baltic, ivory from Africa. Languages mingled together, Greek, Latin, Persian, Arabic. The streets were alive with a chorus of voices, each carrying a different tongue, yet all drawn to the same place. By night, the city glowed with lamps. The great dome of Hagia Sophia seemed to float above the skyline, its windows spilling light into the dark like a lantern guiding ships. Candles flickered in chapels, their flames trembling against golden mosaics of saints and angels, and from the harbours one could hear the creak of ships at rest, sails furled, awaiting the morning tide. Constantinople was not fully Greek, nor fully Roman. It was both, and more. It was a bridge of cultures, a fusion of East and West. Emperors processed through its streets in robes of purple, while humble monks whispered prayers in hidden monasteries. Soldiers trained in its courtyards, while scholars copied ancient texts by lamplight, preserving knowledge for centuries yet to come. But time, as always, moved on, and with time came storms. Armies approached the walls, first Persians, then Arabs, then Crusaders from the west. Yet again and again Constantinople endured. Its walls held, its fires were rekindled, its markets reopened. To many, it seemed the city would never fall. But in 1453, after more than 1,000 years of endurance, the inevitable arrived. The Ottoman Turks surrounded Constantinople. Cannons thundered at its gates. The once impenetrable walls cracked under the new power of gunpowder. And after weeks of siege, the city opened to new rulers. Yet it was not destroyed. It was embraced. The Ottomans entered the city, and they gave it another name, Istanbul. Minarets rose beside domes, slender towers pointing heavenward. The call to prayer drifted across streets that once echoed with church bells. Markets still hummed, but now in Turkish, Arabic, and Persian alongside Greek. The stones of the old basilicas remained, but their voices were new. Hagia Sophia, once a church, became a mosque, and its vast dome continued to shelter the faithful. And so the city endured, even as its names shifted like seasons. Byzantium, Constantinople, Istanbul. Each name spoke of power. Each name reflected a different ruler, a different vision, a different age. But beneath the names, the hills were the same. The Bosphorus still glittered. The harbour still welcomed ships. The sun still rose over its domes and rooftops. This is the lesson of Byzantium. Power rooted in geography does not fade. A city at the crossroads of worlds cannot be erased. It adapts. It wears new robes, speaks new tongues, raises new prayers. Like a traveller dressing for a new journey, it changes its cloak with each season, and by changing, it survives. Think of the names once more, like a lullaby. Byzantium, Constantinople, Istanbul, each a layer of memory, each a testament to survival. For names are stories, and stories, like rivers, flow on. And so, as you drift deeper into rest, remember this. Power that is bound to place, to geography, endures beyond crowns and empires. The city of many names remains, eternal in stone and water, ever-changing in story and sound. Chapter 3. Egypt, pharaohs become gods. Far to the south, beyond deserts of drifting sand and horizons without end, flows a river that has carried life for thousands of years. The Nile. Its waters shine beneath the sun, a ribbon of silver uncoiling across the land. Along its banks, green life gathers in defiance of the desert. Stalks of grain bend to the wind. Palms rise tall, their fronds swaying softly. Villages made of mud brick cluster close to its edge, their homes cool within, their walls painted in shades of red and white. At dawn, the river glows pink with the rising light. Fishermen push out small boats carved from papyrus reeds, their nets glistening with dew. Children laugh as they chase one another through fields, their voices blending with the call of herons and cranes. Farmers, barefoot in the mud, guide cattle slowly through irrigation channels, coaxing the earth to yield food for the season ahead. Here, in this world shaped by water, kings once rose. At first they were men, rulers like any other, crowned with reeds draped in gold, sitting on thrones of stone cooled by shaded halls. Their palaces echoed with the sound of flutes and drums. Courtiers bowed low, whispering in reverence. Their words carried weight. Their armies defended borders. But for all their majesty, they were still men. Over time, however, the perception changed. The role deepened. Slowly, softly, the kings of Egypt were lifted beyond humanity. They were no longer seen as rulers alone. They were gods upon the earth. Temples whispered their names. Priests sang their titles in sacred hymns, voices rising with the smoke of incense that curled against ceilings painted blue with golden stars. Scribes carved their words carefully into stone, each hieroglyph shaped with precision, ensuring that the king's essence would never be forgotten. Each inscription, each prayer, each offering carried the ruler further from mortality and closer to eternity. The pyramids rose from the horizon like mountains made by hands. Great stones quarried, hauled, and placed one upon another, rising toward the sky. They were not merely tombs, they were stairways. Step by step, they carried the pharaoh's soul upward, lifting him from the earth to the realm of gods. At sunrise, their golden tips caught the first rays of light, gleaming like beacons of immortality. At sunset they glowed with the last fire of the day, promising that light would always return. Inside, hidden chambers waited in silence. Narrow passages led to sarcophagi of carved stone, polished and heavy. Walls were lined with spells and stories, guides for the pharaoh's journey into the afterlife. Painted figures of gods stretched their hands outward, Anubis the jackal guiding the soul, Isis protective and gentle, Ra, the sun, circling endlessly in his boat across the heavens. When a pharaoh walked his palace in life, he was not seen as a man. He was Horus, the falcon, soaring above the world. His gaze stretched beyond the fields, beyond the river, into eternity. When he died, he was Osiris, ruler of the underworld, lord of resurrection, whose body was torn and reassembled so that life itself could continue. In this cycle, each pharaoh became part of the eternal pattern. Living, he was the falcon. In death, he was the god who promised rebirth. To disobey such a figure was unthinkable. To resist the pharaoh was not to resist politics or law. It was to resist the universe itself. To deny him was to deny the rhythm of the sun rising, the flood of the Nile, the endless turning of stars. His word was woven into the very fabric of existence. And so the people obeyed. They did not need whips or swords to remind them. Belief itself was the strongest chain. It bent their heads in reverence. It steadied their hands as they worked in fields or temples. It united Egypt. From the far south at the cataracts to the wide delta where the river met the sea. Temples became centres of this belief. Karnak with its towering forest of columns, each carved with gods and kings. Luxor, its halls glittering in torchlight, filled with chanting voices. Abu Simbel cut into rock itself, its statues of Ramses seated like giants watching over the Nile. Every temple reminded the people the pharaoh was more than a ruler. He was the balance of the cosmos. Priests reinforced this truth with ritual. At dawn they washed statues of gods, dressing them in linen, adorning them with jewellery, placing fresh food and flowers at their feet. These were not mere symbols, they were acts of renewal, moments that bound the pharaoh and the divine together. Festivals filled the calendar. The Opet festival at Thebes, when the god Amun travelled from Karnak to Luxor, carried on a sacred bark, his presence blessing the city. The people filled the streets with music and offerings, convinced that their pharaoh himself was part of the procession, a bridge between earth and heaven. The Nile itself became proof of this sacred power. Each year its floods returned, bringing rich black silt to the fields. The people believed the pharaoh's divinity ensured this rhythm. Without him, the river might not rise. Without him, famine might spread. The cycle of nature and the cycle of rule became one story. Even in death, the pharaoh's power did not end. Through mummification, his body was preserved, wrapped carefully in linen layer upon layer, until he was bound like a sacred figure. Gold masks covered his face, not to hide but to reveal the god within. Charms and amulets were placed upon him, each inscribed with words of protection. The Book of the Dead was buried with him, its spells a guide through the dangers of the underworld. And at last he was placed within stone chambers, where his journey would continue forever. The people did not mourn as though he were gone. They believed he had transformed. He had stepped into eternity, becoming Osiris, ensuring the Nile would rise, the sun would burn, the stars would turn. His successor, the next pharaoh, was not merely his heir. He was Horus reborn, the eternal cycle continuing. Through dynasties this pattern endured. Khufu, who raised the Great Pyramid. Ramses, whose temples carved into cliffs declared his eternal reign. Hatshepsut, a woman who wore the false beard of Pharaoh, rebranding herself into kingship so completely that her image was carved in stone as both queen and king. Akhenaten, who turned the worship of Egypt toward the sun disk, reshaping gods themselves to match his vision. Cleopatra, whose name still echoes, blending divinity and politics in the final days of Egypt's ancient glory. Each one wrapped themselves in eternity, each one cloaked in the mantle of the divine. This was Egypt's greatest rebranding, not the crown of reeds nor the throne of stone, but the transformation of a human ruler into a god, a man yet eternal, a woman yet divine. Their power was not only political but spiritual. They commanded not just armies, but the very faith of their people. Even now, thousands of years later, their presence lingers. The pyramids rise against the horizon, unshaken by time. The temples stand in silence, their columns broken yet still reaching toward the sky. Statues sit with patient faces, lips closed, eyes unblinking, gazing into forever. Their names still ripple through history: Ramses, Hatshepsut, Cleopatra. They are remembered not only as rulers, but as gods. If these rhythms of Egypt bring you comfort, if the stillness of the Nile eases your mind, remember to like this video and subscribe to Pattern of Power. This series will continue, carrying you gently through the patterns of history into quiet stories that soothe and endure. And so Egypt lasted not for decades nor even centuries, but millennia. A civilization rebranded in stone and spirit, enduring through faith, through ritual, through belief. Kings who were men, men who became gods, and gods who still watch, even now, as the Nile flows endlessly beneath the desert sun. Chapter 4: Alexander's Afterlife. When Alexander fell, the world he conquered was still young, still wet clay in the hands of time. His empire was vast, impossibly vast, a stretch of land that ran from the mountains of Greece to the rivers of India, from the deserts of Egypt to the valleys of Persia. It was as if one man had drawn a single breath, and in that breath had tried to contain the world. But breaths, no matter how deep, cannot last forever. And when his eyes closed for the final time in Babylon, the air was released. The empire loosened, and the dream scattered, like sand slipping through the open palm. The men who had marched beside him, men hardened by battles, by years of hunger, wounds, and endless marches, gathered around his bed. They were his generals, his companions, his so-called successors. They had crossed deserts with him, stormed cities with him, stood shoulder to shoulder under rain and sun. They had seen him lead charges, had felt his presence in the dust of battle, had shouted his name as the banner of victory. But now, standing in silence round his still body, their thoughts did not turn to preservation. They turned to possession. Not one of them sought to preserve the empire whole. Instead, each reached for their peace. Each remembered promises, whispers, claims of succession. Each thought of himself not as servant, but as heir. The empire Alexander had built in one great sweep became a table to be carved. the Ptolemies claimed Egypt. They took the city of Alexandria, that coastal jewel Alexander himself had sketched upon the sands. There they ruled for centuries, their palaces rising beside the Nile, their great lighthouse, the Pharaohs, glowing across the waves like a star. In its libraries, scrolls gathered from across the known world, a treasury not of gold but of words. In its harbours, ships swelled with goods and stories, each arriving from distant seas. The Seleucids spread themselves across Asia, stretching from Syria into the old lands of Persia, further east into the tangled legacy of Babylonian kings. Their courts echoed with many voices, Greek and Persian, Eastern and Western. Their palaces blended columns with arches, marble with brick, tradition with invention. They were heirs to Alexander, but also to Cyrus and Darius, carrying the weight of multiple legacies upon their shoulders. The Antigonids held Macedon, the homeland. It was a smaller realm compared to Egypt or Asia, but it was soil soaked with Alexander's childhood. These hills had raised him, had watched him ride as a boy beneath the eyes of Aristotle, had seen him set out with dreams that soon became destiny. To rule Macedon was to hold the root of the tree, even if its branches now sprawled across continents. Each successor carved his share, yet none let go of Alexander's light. His face still appeared on their coins, the strong chin, the wavy hair, the gaze turned just slightly upward, as though watching something beyond human sight. Statues bore his likeness, cast in bronze or carved in marble, some towering above city squares, others small enough to rest upon an altar. And stories grew. Some said he had been the son of Zeus, lightning-born, carrying a spark of divinity. Others whispered that he had spoken with oracles at Siwa, had been told he was chosen, destined to bind the world together. Sailors swore he had reached the edges of the earth, that he had seen the ocean no Greek had ever seen. Poets sang of him as one who had walked among gods, who had entered history not as mortal but as myth. And myths, unlike empires, do not collapse with borders. Myths outlast armies, they outlast walls. They are retold, reshaped, reforged. They slip from mouth to mouth, century to century, and Alexander, though dead, became more alive in story than he had been in flesh. This is how power survives sometimes, not in unity, not in a single throne, not in armies standing beneath one banner. Sometimes power survives in fragments, in echoes, in memory. The empire scattered, yes. It broke into shards, each sharp, each dangerous. But every shard still glittered with the reflection of Alexander's name. Each ruler who claimed a share wrapped himself in that shadow. Each whispered to his people, "I am Alexander's heir. His blood, his vision, his fire runs in me." And in that whisper, power lingered. The people believed. They saw Alexander in coins, in temples, in rituals. They repeated his name in markets, in homes, in songs, and so his presence endured, woven into daily life long after his body had been placed in a tomb. The tomb itself became legend. Some say it lay in Alexandria, visited by Caesars, admired by emperors centuries later. Others say it was hidden, its exact place lost, as though the earth itself conspired to preserve the mystery. Pilgrims came seeking it, writers dreamed of it. But even when unseen, its presence shaped imagination. Think of it, a single man whose breath of conquest lasted scarcely more than a decade, Yet that breath carried so far, its echo has never stopped. Rome itself looked back to Alexander. Caesars envied him, sought to surpass him. Generals measured themselves against him, often falling short. Artists painted him, dramatists spoke of him, scholars argued over him. The East remembered him too, as Sikandar, the world conqueror, the figure who strode through Persian tales and Indian epics. Each culture reshaped him, claimed him, called him their own. And so, the brand of Alexander, for that is what it became, spread wider than the empire had ever been. His empire was a map, but his myth was a language, and that language was spoken across centuries, across continents, long after borders had shifted and names had changed. Power scattered, and yet power endured. The Seleucids would fade, their lands carved again by new empires. The Antigonids would fall, Macedon taken, its soil walked by foreign boots. The Ptolemies, the last of Alexander's heirs, would hold Egypt until Cleopatra, the final queen, whose life and death would tie Greek blood to Roman destiny. But even as dynasties ended, Alexander remained, not as ruler, not as king, but as symbol. And symbols, like myths, outlive empires. They move freely, unbroken, untouched by the rise and fall of thrones. If you're still with me, still drifting through this quiet history, if your eyes are not yet heavy, consider subscribing to Pattern of Power. It helps these calm journeys continue. But if you're already half asleep, let Alexander's name itself carry you further. Let it echo in your dreams as softly as it echoed through centuries. And so his empire did not vanish, though it fractured into pieces. It lived on in Egypt, in Syria, in Macedon. It lived on in coins and statues, in poems and tales. It lived on in the envy of Caesars, in the whispers of generals, in the imagination of nations. The man was gone, but the idea of Alexander, that never died. Power can scatter and still endure, not as unity but as memory, not as conquest but as story. And stories, quiet, endless, flowing, outlive empires. Chapter 5. The Ottomans, Sultans to Caliphs, 1453, a year that marked an ending and a beginning. For centuries Constantinople had stood, its walls rising like a stone horizon. Generations had looked upon those walls and thought them unshakable. Thick towers guarded by centuries of memory, gates where kings and emperors had once stood watch. The city had been tested time and again. Armies had come with siege engines, with ladders, with fire, with dreams of conquest. And always they had turned away, defeated by the endurance of stone. For 1,000 years Constantinople was thought eternal. Poets wrote of it as the jewel of the world, the city of the world's desire. Merchants spoke of its harbours where ships from every sea found rest. Pilgrims whispered of its relics, its churches crowned with domes that glittered in the sun. To capture Constantinople seemed impossible, like trying to capture the horizon itself. But nothing is eternal. The sun that rises must one day set. Even the strongest stones will crack when time presses long enough. And so, in 1453, the gates of Constantinople creaked with the weight of history. Its walls, once impenetrable, shuddered beneath new cannons that shook the earth itself. Into the city walked the Ottomans. Yet when they entered, they did not erase what was there. The domes still rose rounded against the sky. The market still hummed with traders and buyers, their voices carrying across narrow lanes. The waters of the Bosphorus still sparkled beneath the morning light. The bones of the city remained, its streets, its harbours, its hills. What changed was not stone, but meaning. The Ottomans embraced it. They claimed it not as a spoil of war, but as a jewel for their crown. They called it their capital, their heart. The city became Istanbul, not erased, but reborn. And yet the Ottomans did more than claim a city. They claimed an identity. The sultans were already rulers, heirs to a dynasty forged through centuries of conquest. Their banners had flown over Anatolia. Their armies had pressed into the Balkans. Their power had been growing brick by brick, field by field. But now, with Constantinople in their hands, they became more than emperors. They became caliphs, leaders of the faithful, heirs of the prophet's mantle. This transformation was quiet, almost soft, yet it magnified their power beyond measure. They were no longer only kings of land. They became shepherds of souls, not only rulers of territory, but guardians of faith. With one stroke, one name, their power multiplied. One crown became two. One throne carried the weight of empire and belief. And what did that mean? It meant that a sultan's command was not only a matter of soldiers and taxes, it was a command believed to carry divine weight. To obey the sultan was to obey the caliph. To honour the caliph was to honour faith itself. Sword and scripture, crown and prayer merged into a single seat of authority. This was rebranding at its most powerful. The mantle of empire stretched across continents. The mantle of faith stretched across the hearts of millions. Woven together, they held the Ottoman world in place. From their capital, the Ottomans spread their reach. Across Europe, their banners unfurled over the Balkans, over Hungary, pressing close to the walls of Vienna itself. Across Asia, they secured Anatolia, Syria, Mesopotamia, lands once ruled by Persians, Romans, Byzantines. Across Africa, their ships and soldiers pressed into Egypt, North Africa, and beyond. An empire of 3 continents, united not only by conquest, but by the names and stories that bound it together. And names mattered. A city was Constantinople, then it was Istanbul. A word shifted, and meaning shifted with it. A ruler was sultan, then he was also caliph. A title expanded, and with it the aura of authority. The lesson is simple, yet profound. Names are not just words, they are vessels. They carry memory, legitimacy, faith. They can bend the loyalty of people, bind strangers into a common cause, and stretch the reach of power far beyond the limits of geography. Think of Istanbul in those first days under Ottoman rule. The Hagia Sophia, once the great cathedral of Christendom, echoed with a new sound. No longer only the tolling of bells, but the call to prayer, rising 5 times a day, drifting across domes and minarets. The marble floors were the same, the mosaic still glimmered, but the meaning had shifted. Church became a mosque. A space of one faith became the heart of another. And the city breathed differently, even though its stones had not moved. Markets filled with voices in many tongues, Turkish, Arabic, Greek, Persian. Caravans brought silk, spice, coffee. Ships carried grain, olive oil, timber. And above this hum of life, the Sultan's shadow stretched, not only as emperor but as caliph. Every purchase, every prayer, every stone laid for a new building whispered the same truth. This was now the heart of the Ottoman world, and as centuries passed that identity endured. The Ottomans became the long guardians of both empire and faith. Their courts glowed with ceremony, robes of silk, thrones of ivory, processions where music and incense wove together. Their armies, fierce and disciplined, marched under banners stitched with verses. Their scholars debated law, their poets recited in palaces, their architects raised mosques whose domes still shine today. They were heirs to Rome, for they held Constantinople. They were heirs to Islam, for they claimed the Caliphate, and in that double inheritance their power found roots deep and wide. For centuries they endured, through battles, through sieges, through shifting fortunes. Their empire was not only of stone and steel, but of words, of stories, of belief, and belief is often the stronger wall. This is the quiet strength of rebranding, a city renamed, a ruler retitled. The forms remained, stone walls, domes, markets, but the meaning deepened, and when meaning deepens, power secures itself. If you are still with me, still drifting with these words, consider subscribing to Pattern of Power. It helps these journeys continue, keeps history flowing softly into sleepless nights. But if your eyes are already heavy, if you are sinking into dreams, let this story be a lullaby. Imagine the domes of Istanbul glowing under moonlight. Imagine the call to prayer drifting softly across the Bosphorus. Imagine a city eternal, yet ever-changing, holding within its stones the power of names. And so, the Ottomans endured, with one hand upon the sword and the other upon scripture, with a crown upon their heads and a mantle upon their shoulders, sultans but also caliphs, guardians of both empire and faith. The lesson, whispered across time, is clear. Names hold power, stories hold power, and when bound together, they can hold whole empires in place. An empire not only of soldiers and walls, but of identity. An empire not only of stone, but of words. Not only of steel, but of belief. And belief, as history shows, can endure longer than any fortress. Chapter 6. Modern Lessons. The story of power is not only ancient, it is alive today, in the brands, nations, and institutions that surround us. The empires of the past used stone, steel, and scripture to hold their place in history. Today, companies and nations use design, stories, and names. Yet the rhythm is the same. The lesson is the same. To endure, power must sometimes rebrand. It must shed one skin and step quietly into another. Take Apple. Once it was a company of computers, nothing more. Its earliest machines were plain, square, and practical. They sat on desks in classrooms and offices, useful but uninspiring. The beige boxes of the 1980s were not objects of desire, they were merely tools. For years, Apple struggled. Its products were respected by a small circle of enthusiasts, but its name carried little weight with the broader world. By the mid-1990s, the company teetered on the edge of collapse. Analysts wondered whether Apple would disappear entirely, swallowed by stronger rivals. And yet, it did not disappear. It transformed. Apple rebranded itself. This rebranding was not a single act, not just the release of one product, but a slow and careful shift in identity. The machines were redesigned, no longer beige, but silver, white, black. They were not only computers now, they were works of art. Their surfaces gleamed, their edges curved. They looked less like tools for labour, and more like objects meant to be displayed, admired. carried with pride. With this new look came a new message. Apple was no longer selling only utility, it was selling meaning. To own a Mac was to express yourself. To hold an iPod was to carry music as an extension of your soul. To use an iPhone was to step into modernity, to signal that you were part of something new. These devices were still tools, but they were also mirrors. They reflected back an image of identity to the person holding them. It is here that the quiet magic of rebranding lies. A company does not always need to change what it offers. It needs to change what people believe it represents. Apple turned from a company of computers into a company of symbols. Its logo, once overlooked, became one of the most recognizable in the world. And behind that symbol stood not only machines, but a lifestyle. Apple survived, and then it dominated, not because it built the fastest processors, but because it convinced millions that its devices were extensions of themselves. Rebranding is not limited to companies. Nations too carry the same need to reshape their images, to outgrow the shadows of their past. Japan offers a profound example. In the first half of the 20th century, Japan was known for empire and war. Its name was tied to conquest and destruction. Images of burning cities, invasions, and atomic devastation became part of its global identity. To many, Japan was a nation scarred, a defeated empire whose story might have ended there. But stories rarely end so neatly. After the war, Japan began to rebuild. Its leaders and people understood that power could no longer be found in armies or in conquest. Instead, it could be found in productivity, in culture, in technology, and in the rebranding of the nation itself. Factories rose from the rubble of bombed-out cities. Craftsmen refined their methods. Engineers experimented. Companies grew. Within decades, Japan transformed its image. No longer was it seen primarily as a nation of war. It became known for efficiency, for precision, for beauty in design. Bullet trains cut swiftly across its landscape, becoming symbols of punctuality and progress. Cameras carried the names Nikon and Canon into homes around the world. Automobiles bearing Toyota, Honda, and Nissan became icons of reliability. Cultural exports, from poetry and film to animation and cuisine, reshaped how the world thought of Japan. The shift was not immediate, nor was it absolute. History's scars remain. But Japan's rebranding was successful enough that today, when one hears the name, the first thought is rarely of empire. It is of technology, of culture, of refinement. The rebranding did not erase the past, but it layered over it, allowing a new story to emerge. This is the same pattern again. The old cloak set aside, a new one gently draped over the shoulders of power. The essence remains. The nation endures, but the image shifts. And in our own time there is another story, more recent, more fragile. Facebook, a name once synonymous with connection, faced its own reckoning. At first, Facebook was a marvel. It linked friends, families, strangers across continents. It carried faces, voices, and memories into digital spaces. It promised openness, belonging, the feeling of being part of something larger than oneself. For years, it grew without limit, expanding into nearly every corner of the world. But shadows gathered, scandals rose, questions of privacy, of manipulation, of division spread across the public imagination. The name that once signalled connection began to carry suspicion. For many, Facebook no longer meant community, it meant conflict. No matter how vast the network, A name burdened with mistrust becomes heavy to carry. And so, the company sought escape. It rebranded itself as Meta. The new name was not chosen at random. It signalled ambition. It suggested movement beyond the present into something vast, something futuristic, something less burdened by the controversies of the past. Meta sought to define itself not only as a network of social connections, but as the architect of a new digital world, a metaverse. Whether that dream will last, no one can yet say. The rebranding is still young and the story still unfolding, but the attempt itself reveals the ancient rhythm again. When power is threatened, when names grow heavy, survival often requires transformation. To endure, it must take on a new face. The lesson across these examples is simple but profound. Rome became empire without declaring itself so. Byzantium became Constantinople, then Istanbul, with each name carrying forward the same stones and streets. Pharaohs became gods, cloaking kingship in divinity. Alexander became a myth, living on in stories long after his empire dissolved. The Ottomans became not only sultans but caliphs, uniting empire and faith beneath a single crown. And today, Apple becomes lifestyle. Japan becomes culture and innovation. Facebook becomes Meta, hoping to become the architect of tomorrow. The pattern is clear. Names hold power. Stories hold power. A name is more than a word. It is a vessel of meaning. A story is more than memory. It is a bridge across generations. And power, to survive, must often change the vessel while keeping the essence. To survive, power must sometimes disappear, only to return in a new form. To last, it must sometimes slip quietly into another name. This is why empires do not always end with conquest, why companies do not always die with debt, why nations do not always vanish after defeat. They rebrand, they transform, they whisper a new story, and the world, weary of the old one, listens. And so the old truth continues. Power is not only what it is what it appears to be. And so our hour drifts to its end. Rome, Byzantium, Egypt, Alexander, the Ottomans, and even the modern names of today all show the same truth. Power survives by slipping into a new story, by wearing new robes while holding the same thread beneath. As you close your eyes, remember power rests not only in what it is, but in what it appears to be. If you're still with us, thank you for listening. Like, subscribe, and join us again for another quiet journey. But if you're already asleep, then may your dreams be calm and your night be peaceful. Good night.